The blizzard hit without warning, turning my peaceful Montana evening into a nightmare of howling wind and blinding snow. I pressed my face against the kitchen window, watching my bird feeders swing violently in the storm. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a shadow moving across my backyard. But as lightning illuminated the chaos outside, I realized it was an animal. A large cat struggling through the deep snow. My heart stopped. Living on the edge of wilderness for 15 years as a wildlife biologist, I'd seen my share of mountain lions and bobcats, but never one moving so strangely. The creature stumbled, fell, and didn't get up. Without thinking, I grabbed my heaviest coat and emergency kit. The wind nearly knocked me over as I stepped outside, but I pushed forward. Each step through the knee-deep snow felt like an eternity. The animal wasn't moving anymore. As I got closer, my breath caught. It was a bobcat, a magnificent male with thick winter fur now matted with ice. His amber eyes were barely open, and his breathing was so shallow I could hardly see his chest rise. Hypothermia. He was dying. Every instinct screamed at me to call wildlife services and wait for professionals. But in this storm, help wouldn't arrive for hours. This beautiful creature would be dead by morning. I'd rescued countless animals before, but never brought a wild predator into my home. My hands shook as I carefully wrapped him in my emergency blanket. He was surprisingly light, probably hadn't eaten in days. "Okay, big guy," I whispered, lifting him carefully. "Let's get you warm." The decision would haunt me for weeks. I just didn't know why yet. Carrying a half-conscious bobcat into my living room felt surreal. His weight pressed against my chest as I navigated through my front door, snow melting from his fur onto my hardwood floors. I'd converted my spare bedroom into a makeshift wildlife rehabilitation space years ago, but it had only housed injured birds and small mammals, never anything with claws this size. I laid him gently on the padded examination table, his breathing still dangerously shallow. Hypothermia was the immediate threat. I cranked up the heat and positioned warming lamps around him, careful to maintain distance from his powerful paws. Even unconscious, a bobcat could seriously injure someone with a reflexive swipe. His vital signs were weak, but steady. Dehydration was obvious from his sunken eyes and dry gums. I prepared an IV setup, something I'd done hundreds of times with domestic animals during my veterinary training. But this felt different. This was crossing a line I'd never crossed before. "What am I doing?" I muttered, checking his temperature. Dangerously low, but not fatal yet. The storm raged outside, rattling my windows. No chance of getting him to the wildlife center tonight. I was on my own with a predator that could kill me the moment he regained strength. I started the IV drip and covered him with heated blankets, monitoring his breathing every few minutes. His fur was beautiful up close, thick spotted patterns that spoke of perfect evolutionary design. This wasn't just any bobcat. He was massive, probably an alpha male. As the hours passed, his breathing improved. Color returned to his gums. I dozed in the chair beside him, jerking awake every time he stirred. By dawn, his eyes opened fully for the first time. Golden, intelligent, and absolutely terrifying. Those amber eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood freeze. I'd studied predator behavior for years, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different. He wasn't just looking at me. He was evaluating me, calculating whether I was threat or prey. I remained perfectly still in my chair, barely breathing. His head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring as he processed my scent. Every muscle in his body tensed, ready to spring despite his weakened condition. I could see the confusion in his eyes. Where was he? How did he get here? "Easy, boy," I whispered, keeping my voice low and calm. "You're safe." His ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. The sound sent primitive fear coursing through my veins. This wasn't a house cat. This was 40 pounds of pure predator, designed by nature to kill. I slowly reached for the sedative I'd prepared just in case. But but something in his eyes stopped me. Behind the wildness, I saw intelligence. He was studying me just as intently as I was studying him. Minutes passed in tense silence. His breathing remained elevated, but he didn't attack. Instead, he seemed to be taking inventory of his situation. The warm room, the IV in his leg, the soft blankets surrounding him. Gradually, his muscles relaxed. The growling stopped. He laid his head back down, but kept those golden eyes fixed on me. It was as if he understood that I'd helped him, even if he didn't trust me yet. I spent the next hour moving in slow motion, checking his vitals and adjusting his IV. He watched every movement but didn't react aggressively. We were establishing our first tentative communication, predator and human, finding an impossible balance. The next 3 days passed in a careful dance of mutual respect and growing trust. I established a routine that seemed to calm him, checking his vitals at the same times, speaking in the same gentle tone, moving with deliberate slowness. He began to anticipate my presence, his ears perking up when he heard my footsteps approaching. His recovery was remarkable. The IV had rehydrated him, and his body temperature stabilized. I introduced small amounts of food, raw chicken and fish that I kept for wildlife rehabilitation. He ate cautiously at first, never taking his eyes off me, but his appetite returned quickly. What surprised me most was his intelligence. He seemed to understand that the IV was helping him and didn't try to remove it. When I changed his blankets, he would shift his body to make the process easier. These weren't random behaviors. He was actively cooperating. By the 4th day, something extraordinary happened. I was sitting in my usual chair, updating his medical chart, when I heard a sound I'd never expected. A soft, rumbling purr. I looked up to find him watching me with what could only be described as contentment. "You're feeling better, aren't you?" I said softly. His ears twitched forward and the purring continued. It was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard from a wild animal. I made a decision that went against every protocol I'd ever learned. Slowly, carefully, I extended my hand toward him. He sniffed cautiously, then did something that took my breath away. He gently bumped his head against my palm. The connection was electric. Here was a creature that should have seen me as either threat or prey, showing affection. I scratched behind his ears and his purring intensified. We'd crossed another line and there was no going back. On the 5th morning, I woke to find him standing at the window, fully alert and obviously much stronger. His golden eyes tracked something outside with intense focus. I followed his gaze and gasped. Another bobcat sat in my backyard, smaller, more delicate, clearly female. She was calling to him with soft chirps and mews, pacing back and forth in the snow. My rescued bobcat responded with his own vocalizations, a complex conversation I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. "She's looking for you, isn't she?" I whispered. He turned to me, then back to the window, his distress obvious. This changed everything. He wasn't just a lone animal I'd rescued. He had a mate waiting for him. The female approached the house cautiously, her belly noticeably swollen. My heart sank as realization hit me. She was pregnant, and probably close to giving birth. In this harsh winter, she needed her mate to help hunt and protect their territory. I faced an impossible decision. He was strong enough to survive outside now, but releasing him meant losing the incredible bond we'd formed. More importantly, I had to consider what was best for both cats and their unborn kits. I spent the day observing their interaction through the window. She would approach, call to him, then retreat when she caught my scent. He grew increasingly agitated, pacing and vocalizing more frequently. That evening, I made my choice. I prepared a large carrier and opened the window to the rehabilitation room. "It's time, isn't it?" I said softly. He looked at me with those intelligent amber eyes, and I swear I saw gratitude there. He approached me one last time, bumping his head against my hand in farewell. Then he leaped through the window and disappeared into the night with his mate. The silence in my house was deafening. For 5 days, I'd grown accustomed to his presence. The soft sounds of his breathing, the rustle of blankets as he shifted position, the occasional rumbling purr that had become my favorite sound in the world. Now the rehabilitation room felt hollow and cold, despite the heating lamps still running. I sat in the chair where I'd spent countless hours watching over him, staring at the empty examination table. The rational part of my mind knew I'd done the right thing. He belonged in the wild with his mate, not confined in my house. But my heart felt shattered. I tried to return to my normal routine, updating research papers, analyzing wildlife population data, preparing for spring field studies. Nothing held my attention. Every sound outside made me rush to the window, hoping for a glimpse of golden fur in the trees. 3 days passed with no sign of either cat. I told myself this was normal, that they'd moved on to establish their territory elsewhere. Bobcats were solitary creatures except during mating season. They didn't form lasting bonds with humans. So why did I feel like I'd lost a family member? On the 4th night, I was awakened by a sound that made my heart race. The distinctive call of a bobcat in distress. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside, following the cries into the woods behind my house. What I found there would haunt me forever. The female lay motionless in a small clearing, her body partially covered by fresh snow. She'd given birth, but something had gone terribly wrong. The scent of blood hung heavy in the cold air, and somewhere in the darkness, I could hear the desperate cries of newborn kits, calling for a mother who would never answer. My hands shook as I approached the tragic scene, flashlight beam dancing across the snow. The female bobcat lay peacefully, as if sleeping, but the stillness told the whole story. Complications during birth. It happened in the wild more often than people realized. The cries of the kits grew more urgent, and I followed the sound to a small depression beneath a fallen log. 3 tiny forms huddled together, no bigger than house cats, their eyes still sealed shut. They were maybe hours old, their fur damp and barely developed. Without their mother's warmth, they wouldn't survive the night. I carefully gathered them into my jacket, their tiny bodies trembling against my chest. They were so small, so helpless. In the wild, this would be the end of their story. But I couldn't let that happen. As I turned to head back to the house, I heard a familiar sound, the soft footfall of large paws in snow. My rescued bobcat emerged from the shadows, his golden eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. He approached his mate's body, nuzzling her gently, a heartbreaking whine escaping his throat. The grief in that sound cut through my soul. He looked at me, then at the bundle in my jacket where his kits were crying. For a moment, I thought he might attack me for taking them. Instead, he did something that defied everything I knew about wild animal behavior. He approached me slowly, sniffed the kits in my arms, then looked directly into my eyes. It was a look of desperate plea, of a father who knew he couldn't care for newborns alone. "I'll take care of them," I whispered. "I promise." He touched his nose to my hand once, then disappeared back into the forest. I was now the mother to 3 orphaned bobcat kits. The next weeks blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and constant worry. Raising newborn bobcat kits was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. They needed feeding every 2 hours with specialized formula, their body temperature regulated constantly, and their elimination stimulated manually, tasks their mother would have performed instinctively. I converted my entire living room into a nursery, setting up heating pads, incubators, and feeding stations. The kits, 2 males and 1 female, grew stronger each day, their eyes opening after 10 days to reveal the same golden amber as their fathers. They were beautiful, with thick spotted coats and oversized paws that promised impressive size when fully grown. I named them Storm, Shadow, and Luna, though I knew I shouldn't get attached. They were wild animals that would eventually need to return to their natural habitat. But watching them play, hearing their tiny purrs when I fed them, feeling their complete trust as they slept curled against my warmth, it was impossible not to love them. The biggest challenge came when they began to walk. Bobcat kits are naturally curious and incredibly agile. My house became an obstacle course of climbing adventures and hiding spots. I baby-proofed everything, but they found ways to get into trouble I'd never imagined. Storm, the largest male, was the boldest. He would attempt to climb anything vertical, often getting stuck and crying until I rescued him. Shadow was the thinker, watching his siblings' mistakes before attempting his own adventures. Luna was the most affectionate, seeking out my lap whenever she was tired or scared. 3 weeks in, something happened that changed our dynamic forever. I was sleeping on the couch to be near them when I felt a familiar presence. Their father had returned. I woke to find him sitting by the window, those golden eyes watching his kits play in their makeshift nursery. He'd somehow gotten inside through the pet door I'd forgotten to lock, a door that should have been too small for a full-grown bobcat. My heart hammered as I slowly sat up, trying not to startle him or the kits. This was the moment I'd been dreading. Would he try to take them? Attack me for keeping them? Instead, he did something that left me speechless. He approached the play area and began grooming Storm, who had wandered closest to him. The kit purred loudly, recognizing his father's scent immediately. One by one, he cleaned each kit with gentle precision, his rough tongue smoothing their fur. They responded with happy chirps and attempted to nurse from him, confused by his lack of milk, but comforted by his presence. When he finished grooming them, he looked at me expectantly. "You want to help raise them," I said, understanding flooding through me. "You know they need both of us." What followed was the most extraordinary co-parenting arrangement I'd ever witnessed. He would arrive each evening through the pet door, spend hours with his kits, then disappear before dawn. During the day, I handled feeding and care. At night, he provided the wild education they'd need to survive. I watched in amazement as he taught them to stalk invisible prey, to recognize danger signals, to communicate in the complex language of bobcat vocalizations. He was preparing them for a life I could never give them, but he also seemed to understand that they weren't ready yet. When Storm tried to follow him outside one night, his father gently but firmly carried him back to the nursery. We were partners now, united in our love for these 3 precious lives. As the kits grew stronger and more adventurous, their father's visits became longer and more intensive. I began to understand that I was witnessing something rarely seen by humans: the education of wild predators by their parent. He would bring them small prey items, teaching them to recognize the scents and sounds of their future food sources. Mice, birds, even insects became learning tools. The kits would pounce and play, developing the hunting instincts that would keep them alive in the wild. I documented everything, knowing this behavior would be invaluable to wildlife researchers. But more than scientific interest, I felt privileged to witness this ancient dance of survival being passed from father to children. Luna showed the strongest hunting instincts, often the first to react to her father's lessons. Shadow preferred to observe before acting, a cautious nature that would serve him well. Storm was all enthusiasm and little technique, but his size and strength compensated for his lack of finesse. Their father's patience amazed me. When Storm pounced too early and missed an easy target, his father would demonstrate again and again until the kit understood. When Luna got distracted by a butterfly instead of focusing on the lesson, he would gently redirect her attention. But it was the communication between them that truly took my breath away. They had a complex vocabulary of chirps, growls, purrs, and body language that conveyed everything from "pay attention" to "well done" to "danger approaching." I was learning their language too, picking up subtle cues that helped me understand their needs and moods. When Storm's ears flattened in a particular way, he was about to attempt something dangerous. When Luna's tail twitched with a specific rhythm, she was overstimulated and needed quiet time. We were becoming a family, unconventional, impossible, but real. At 8 weeks old, the kits were becoming too large and energetic for indoor life. Their father's lessons had grown more complex, and I could see him growing restless with the limitations of my house. It was time for their first real hunting expedition. I followed them into the woods behind my property, staying far enough back to observe without interfering. Their father led them to a small clearing where he'd apparently been preparing this moment for days. Fresh mouse tracks crisscrossed the snow, and I could see small burrows beneath fallen logs. What happened next was like watching a masterclass in predation. He demonstrated the perfect hunting crouch, showing them how to distribute their weight, how to move silently through snow, how to time the final pounce. The kits mimicked his every movement, their natural instincts awakening under his guidance. Storm was the first to attempt a real hunt. He spotted a mouse emerging from beneath a log and dropped into the crouch his father had shown him. For several heartbeats, he remained perfectly still, then exploded forward in a powerful leap. He missed by inches, but his father's approving rumble told him he'd done well. The technique was perfect. Only experience would improve his timing. Luna's turn came next. She was smaller, but more patient, waiting until a mouse ventured further from its hiding spot before making her move. Her pounce was precise and successful. Her first kill. The pride in their father's eyes was unmistakable as Luna carried her prize back to him. He nuzzled her gently, then demonstrated how to properly dispatch prey quickly and humanely. Shadow, ever the observer, learned from his siblings' attempts. When his opportunity came, he succeeded on his first try. They were becoming real predators, and my heart swelled with pride and sadness in equal measure. That night, as I watched their father groom his successful hunters, I knew our time together was coming to an end. The kits were nearly 3 months old, large enough and skilled enough to begin learning to survive on their own. In the wild, this would be when they started following their parents on longer hunting trips, gradually gaining independence. But our situation was anything but wild. I'd grown to love these 3 kits as if they were my own children. Watching them play, teaching them to trust humans, seeing their personalities develop, it had filled a void in my life I hadn't even known existed. The thought of letting them go felt like losing pieces of my heart. Their father seemed to sense my internal struggle. After the kits fell asleep in their usual pile of warm fur, he approached me where I sat by the window. He looked at me with those intelligent amber eyes, then did something he'd never done before. He placed his massive paw on my hand. The gesture was gentle, deliberate, and somehow conveyed everything he couldn't say in words. He understood what I'd sacrificed to save his family. He knew the love I felt for his kits, but he also knew what was best for them. They needed to be wild. "You're right," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "They belong with you, in the forest, not here with me." He pressed his forehead against my hand for a moment, a gesture of gratitude and farewell that broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. The next morning, I began preparing for the hardest goodbye of my life. I would give them 1 more week to grow stronger, then help transition them to full wildlife. It was the right decision. It was also the most painful thing I'd ever done. The final week passed too quickly and too slowly all at once. I spent every moment I could with the kits, memorizing their individual purrs, the way Luna would curl up against my neck when she was sleepy, how Storm would bring me his favorite toy as a gift, the thoughtful way Shadow would study my face as if trying to understand human emotions. Their father increased his visits, staying longer each day, gradually shifting their dependence from me to him. I watched as he led them on longer expeditions into the woods, teaching them to navigate terrain, recognize territorial markers, and understand the complex social structure of Bobcat society. The hardest part was seeing how naturally they adapted to wildlife. Within days, they were spending more time outside than in, returning to the house only for meals and sleep. Their hunting skills improved dramatically, and they began to exhibit the cautious awareness that would keep them safe from larger predators. I prepared their final transition carefully, setting up feeding stations in the woods where they could find supplemental food if needed while they perfected their hunting skills. I also installed trail cameras to monitor their progress without interfering. On their last night in the house, all 3 kits seemed to sense something was different. They stayed close to me, purring more than usual, as if saying their own goodbyes. Luna slept curled in my lap for hours, something she hadn't done since she was much smaller. Their father watched from across the room, patient and understanding. When morning came, I opened all the doors and windows. "It's time," I told them softly. One by one, they walked to their father. Storm looked back at me once, his golden eyes bright with intelligence and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Then they disappeared into the forest together. I stood in my empty house and cried for an hour. 6 months later, I was working in my garden when I heard a familiar sound, the soft chirp of a bobcat greeting. I looked up to see 3 magnificent young adults watching me from the edge of the woods. Storm had grown massive, easily matching his father's size. Shadow was sleek and graceful, his cautious nature evident in his alert posture. Luna was smaller but clearly the leader, her confident stance speaking of successful hunts and territory establishment. Behind them, barely visible in the shadows, their father watched with obvious pride. They approached slowly, cautiously, but without fear. These weren't the helpless kits I'd bottle-fed and worried over. These were wild predators, perfectly adapted to their environment, successful and independent. But they remembered me. Storm was the first to approach, sniffing my outstretched hand before bumping his massive head against my palm. Shadow followed, allowing me to scratch behind his ears for a moment before stepping back. Luna, my sweet Luna, actually purred when I touched her. "Look at you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "You're everything you were meant to be." They stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, letting me see how well they'd grown, how successfully they'd adapted to wildlife. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they melted back into the forest. Their father lingered a moment longer, meeting my eyes one last time. In that gaze, I saw acknowledgement, gratitude, and something that transcended the boundary between human and wild animal: respect. As I watched him disappear into the trees, I realized that what had terrified me most about rescuing that half-frozen bobcat wasn't the danger he posed. It was the love I'd discovered. For him, for his kits, for the wild beauty that exists just beyond our civilized world. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is opening your heart to something you know you'll have to let go. But sometimes, that's exactly what makes it worth doing.